Every week on the Speaking Common Weekly Dungeons and Dragons news, we talk about hot topics and things, not hot topics really, but emerging topics that come up in the world of Dungeons and Dragons mainly. But we also talk a little bit about TTRPGs and things as they might relate to the world of TTRPGs. And as I'm learning to sort of expand out into other systems and things like that, it's really kind of opening my eyes to what else is out there. It's been a relatively slow news week, and still we have lots of things to discuss. So there are a lot of things that are happening. The community has been very active, and I'm looking at different ways to explore that. So with that, I've got a couple of quick community announcements. Like I said, I've started to streamline my process for content back down a little bit to give me more time to focus on the quality of that content. That means I've now landed on these 3 streams that I have had for a long time. So there's the Dungeon Masters Guild Showcase, there's Speaking Common Weekly D&D News, DM Chat, Game Prep, campaign design, everything in between, which is the Saturday flagship show that you are either watching today or going to listen to later this week on the podcast. And then, of course, we have 2Play on Monday, which is where Steph and I get together. We play some video games, things like that. So those are the formalized streams that I have. I've been able to break it all down, and then I'm just making a more aggressive press into Twitch, which is what we've seen the last couple of days. So the new stream openers in play, we're looking at new transitions, and I do have some new information coming about a new show that I'm developing as well. So that's all I'll say about that. I have to keep you in suspense until we get a couple of things tied off, but that is another opportunity to do what I always do, which is focus inward on the community and really highlight and showcase the people that make up the great community that we are, whether it's D&D, TTRPGs, world building, art, all things in between. So with these channels, we're going to be branching a little bit out of D&D. I will still have a specific focus on D&D, but I think it's important to look at other things that are out there, not necessarily systems, but there's just the work that other people are doing in the community. So I'm really looking forward to that. With that, let's talk about the Dungeons & Dragons weekly news. We're going to start with a showcase of some of the new Unearthed Arcana feats that were released this week. There was a lot of really interesting information, and like I said, I don't usually go pretty heavy into Unearthed Arcana on the show because it's playtest. I don't personally allow playtest material in my home game or we'll say my regular games, podcasts, and things like that. But I thought this was interesting specifically because they are blowing out a pretty healthy host of new feats that they're looking to playtest. And of course, as we know, the playtest material is often going to eventually make its way into the game at some point, or at least in some iteration, or it gets left on the cutting room floor depending on the feedback that they get from folks who do play test these options in their games. So this week, Wizards of the Coast, through their Unearthed Arcana stream, announced 16 new feats that are going to be available for players to play test, which involve a lot more player customization. And what I've noticed going through these feats really is they're allowing a lot of cross-pollination between classes. So as you go through these, one of the themes that you'll probably notice is that there are a lot of similarities or a lot of feats that will allow players to dabble in other classes without having to, commit to multi-classing into those vocations or streams. So these include things like flavors of creation, culinary and cooking, raw power and martial prowess, ancient magics, shadow spells, special tactics that are available to them, and a whole lot more. So without further ado, we'll just go down the line in alphabetical order. Artificer Initiate was one of the first ones that were listed, and these all follow suit with what we've seen with some of the features. So there are typically 3 main points, and that's what we'll focus on. There's usually often there's a skill or an ability advantage, and then some kind of mechanical advantage. So Artificer Initiate, which ties back to the Artificer class, allows a character to select 1 cantrip and 1 first level spell. You use intelligence as your spellcasting ability, and you can replace that slot with any other first level slot every time you level. The second benefit is that you can cast one of these every long rest without using any spell slot. But if you are a spellcasting class, then you can use any slot to cast the spells you know. So these all go into the spells you know, and you can cast them as normally through any slot. But you do have that 1 slot available. That's 1 per long rest cast with your intelligence as the spellcasting modifier. And in addition to that, Artificer Initiates get proficiency with artisan tools. And you can also use those tools as a spellcasting focus. So some pretty cool things there for Artificers or characters who want to branch into Artificer without committing to the multi-class. Gamer Mom Luna, gonna lurk. Thank you very much. Absolutely. Please stick around. Knitting a dice bag. I look forward to seeing the finished product. The second feat that was listed in the new set is Chef, which I thought was kind of interesting. I was like, well, I guess this really depends on if you play into cooking and culinary. You can choose to add +1 to either Constitution or Wisdom abilities. You gain proficiency with cook's utensils. And one time per short rest, you can cook special food that gives you 1d8 hit points when a character uses hit dice. So you can cook special food that will grant characters who eat that food an additional 1d8 hit points whenever they use a hit dice. So this is close to, like we see Song of Rest, things that are intended to use during a short rest, really, like when you would use hit dice. Additionally, once per hour, you can create a treat or treats. And when you create these treats, you can use a bonus action to offer temporary hit points to players who consume those treats that is equal to your chef's proficiency bonus. So you can add some kind of cooking play in there too, and these foods will offer some tangible bonuses to your players. Seems like it's really intended for downtime, which makes sense. Like if you're going to cook, then it makes sense that you'd be using this during downtime. Crusher was the third. Crusher allows you to add +1 to your strength or dexterity. The benefits that come with Crusher: once per turn when you deal bludgeoning damage on an attack to a creature, all attacks on that creature are made with advantage until your next turn. If you crit a creature using bludgeoning damage, sorry, I mistook that. Let me start over. Once per turn when you deal bludgeoning damage to a creature, you can move that target 5 feet in any direction that's not occupied, as long as it's no more than one size larger than you. The third benefit is if you crit dealing bludgeoning damage against a creature, all attacks against that creature are made with advantage until your next turn. They announced Eldritch Adept as a playtest feat. The prerequisite for Eldritch Adept is that you have to either have spellcasting or pack magic. So effectively, you have to be a spellcasting class or hybrid, or you have to be a warlock, essentially. And with that, if you take this feat, you can choose one Eldritch invocation from the warlock list. And of course, you have to meet any prerequisites that are required for that invocation. And you can use it normally as a spellcaster. You can also replace that invocation with any other option every time you level, so it gives you some flexibility to play with there. Fey Touched was another new one that was announced. It allows you to add 1 to either your intelligence, wisdom, or charisma ability. It also gives you access to the Misty Step spell and any one first-level spell that you choose, but it has to be from the divination or enchantment school, or what's the word I'm looking for? Not tradition. What is it for wizards? Help me out. Tradition. Arcane tradition. I think that's the word. Maybe I'm messing that up. I might be mixing it up with monks. With Fey Touch, you can also cast that any one of those spells once per long rest, or you can cast it normally in any slot. We'll see that that's kind of standard with the new spell casting feats that are coming out. When they grant you a spell, you can cast them once per long rest, or you can use any slot that you have at your disposal to cast those slots as well, because they then qualify as the spells known in your library. Fighting Initiate is a new one that came through for playtest. It requires you to have proficiency with any martial weapon. So this one's interesting. I'll come back to that. So what it gives you is allows you to learn one fighting style of your choice from the fighter class. So these are the fighter styles like archery, dueling, protection, great weapon fighting. The only prerequisite is that you have to have proficiency with a martial weapon. Now, the reason that's interesting, think about races like High Elves as a subrace of elves. That race gives you proficiency with longsword, and you might be a member of a class that doesn't have proficiency to longsword, but if you do, now you have proficiency with longsword, so that is satisfied, which means you can take Fighting Initiative and also learn a fighting style, which means you could be a wizard a half-elven wizard with a longsword and proficiency in dueling that actually makes you a much more capable combatant. So there's a lot of interesting ways to play with that. The next new feat that was announced is Gunner. So Gunner adds +1 to your dexterity. It also gives you proficiency with firearms if you want to use those rules. If you don't, obviously this would not apply to your campaign. That's kind of discretionary between DMs and players. It allows you to ignore the loading property, which means that you can only fire a weapon once per action, essentially, despite having multiple attacks. And it allows you to ignore disadvantage when you're within 5 feet of a hostile creature. So there are a couple of callouts here, and I'm not really sure about this one. It's a little OP to me. I think one of the things that balance gunplay in D&D and TTRPGs is the fact that you have to reload them. One of the things that balances the power of ranged attacks is that when there's a melee combatant harrying you within 5 feet, that you make all ranged attacks with disadvantage. This feat essentially lets you remove all of that. But on the flip side, it is a level, you have to give a level 4 ability score increase. You have to sacrifice that. You still get your +1 to dex. So I don't know. That it might be a little bit... I'm not a fan of feats that strip out all of the balancing negatives, for lack of a better word, the balancing items for feats. It's like you take these things, they're pretty powerful, but they're balanced in a certain way, and then later you can get a feat that takes away the balance. So just be mindful of those when you're playing with feats. Metamagic Adept is a neat one that basically allows players to pull into the mechanic for sorcerers. The prerequisite, of course, being you have to either be a spell casting class or you have to have pack magic, so you need to be a warlock, if not otherwise. Allows you to learn 2 metamagic options from the sorcerer class, which are great. Pretty powerful options too. You also gain 2 sorcery points. Of course, they need to give you the resource to use those metamagic options to spend on that metamagic. And it can add to existing sort points that you have, but those 2 sorcery points have to be spent on metamagic specifically. I'll clarify that in a minute. And you regain all sorcery points on a long rest, which is standard for sorcerers. So this allows you to kind of sample a piece of sorcerer life. You learn 2 meta magic options. You kind of have to keep them somewhat separate. If you're a sorcerer, you can add them to the 2 that you get to pick anyway, and you get 2 additional sorcery points. The challenge or the clarification that needs to be made there is if you're a sorcerer and you take this in addition, then those 2 sorcery points you have to keep aside because they can only be used for meta magic, because sorcerers can use their sorcerer points in a bunch of different ways. So kind of got to keep a bank of 2 there that are just for meta magic, because they can also create sorcery slots and they can use them for Tides of Chaos and things like that. So these are separate if they're earned through choosing this feat. Getting towards the bottom of the list, Piercer was added, which allows you to add a +1 to your strength or dexterity abilities. The benefits of Piercer as a feat: once per turn, when you deal piercing damage on a combatant or a target, you can re-roll 1 of the damage dice, but you must you must use the new result. So this is kind of like great weapon fighting for piercing weapons. Of course, it's not just limited to things like crossbows. It can spread into javelins, spears, even short swords deal piercing damage, or rapiers. So there's a lot of flexibility there depending on how your class is built and what weapons you like. Additionally, when you crit and deal piercing damage on an enemy, you can roll 1 additional damage die on the crit, which is the extra damage only. So if you do it, you crit, you get an additional damage die for your crit. And the reason they clarify that is it doesn't apply to, let's say, like your sneak attack. If you crit and you use sneak attack, then you get double your damage die for your weapon and double your damage die for your sneak attack. But in this case, that extra damage die for Piercer only applies to the critical damage. So important to keep in mind there too. Poisoner was an interesting one that was levied or introduced this week. When you damage a target, you ignore resistance to poison. So if you're introducing that into your game, if you're the type of character that uses poison with your weapons, this could be potentially powerful. You can coat 1 weapon in poison with a bonus action instead of using an action, and you gain proficiency with the Poisoner's Kit. Additionally, they baked in a poison option for you, which I think is important because you don't want to leave it entirely up to discretion if you're baking it into the game in a feat and you're formalizing that. So once per hour, a poisoner can create doses of poison equal to your proficiency bonus. So this is the amount of doses you can create. They last for 1 minute or when you hit with a weapon. The poison itself forces a save versus Constitution, DC 14, which is pretty respectable, or deals an additional 2d8 damage and creates a poison condition on your target until the end of your next turn. So Poisoner is actually pretty powerful. I like that they're bringing in sort of a more formal poison options for, I have a lot of rogues, so I think that's kind of the trope, who want to use things like that. They enjoy playing it that way. So I think it's nice that they're answering that and that they're offering it to players. Practice Expert is a new feat that's coming through. Allows you to add +1 to any ability, so a lot of flexibility and versatility there. Allows you to add any one proficiency or tool, and you can choose one of your proficiencies and add double your proficiency bonus for that skill. So this is good for players who just want to round out a little bit more, maybe specialize in things on a skill level or proficiency level, which is kind of neat too. Shadow Touched, a new feat that allows you to add +1 to your intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. You also gain access to the Darkness spell and one additional first level spell of your choosing from either the illusion or necromancy schools. You can cast these spells or any one of these spells one time per long rest, or you can use any normal slot to cast those spells as well. Moving on, they introduced shield training with Unearthed Arcana this week, which gives you a +1 to either strength, dexterity, or constitution. You also gain proficiency with shields when you take this feat, and it allows you to don or doff shields as a free action. So that's one kind of sticking point. I do use this in my game, where if you want to switch from a shield to a weapon, you have to use an action to do that. Or I will allow one of those switches per turn as a free action. But if you have two swords, then you can't like sheath a sword and pull a shield. You can either pull a shield and drop the sword, or sheath the sword and then pull the shield in your next round, right? So we had to add some kind of economy around it. Additionally, you can use shields as a spell casting focus. So this is actually pretty strong for like shield bearing clerics or paladins, maybe things like that. It's a pretty good option for. Slasher, a new feat that comes through, lets you add +1 to strength or dexterity. Once per turn, when you deal slashing damage, you can reduce a target's speed by 10 feet until the start of your next turn. If you crit and deal slashing damage to a target, that target has disadvantage until the start of your next turn. So they're bringing in these like damage type-based feats too. Now we've heard one for bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. And the second last one is Tandem Tactician. This is really a great kind of support item. You can use the help action as your bonus action instead of using an action, which of course gives one of your companions advantage on an attack. When you use help, you can increase the range of assistance to 10 feet because typically you have to be in melee range. And you can help up to 2 team members attacking the same target when health is used. So you can actually give that advantage to 2 separate players attacking one target, and you only have to be within 10 feet rather than being within 5 feet or melee range. Last but not least, rounding out the new features available from Wizards of the Coast for playtest this week is Tracker. If you've ever been in the woods, you have Ranger, you know you like to do the tracking thing, follow enemies, figure out their sources, things like that. Tracker might be for you. It allows you to add +1 to your Wisdom ability. It also allows you to learn the Hunter's Mark spell, which you can use once per long rest or cast in any normal slot you have at your disposal. It also gives you advantage on your Wisdom survival checks to track creatures. And that is a wrap on the feats that were announced by Wizards of the Coast this week in Unearthed Arcana. So let me know what you think. How do you feel about those? Continuing onward with the Speaking Common weekly news, and of course we'll jump back into chat and get caught up after this segment and in between each segment. I wanted to talk a little bit about Heroes Feast. So this was something that was announced in D&D Live or during D&D Live. They're actually publishing an official D&D themed cookbook, which is interesting. I mean, realistically, you can cook anything you want and call it anything you want, but it's neat to kind of have a little bit of a formalized thing. I think ultimately this might make a great gift. I'm not sure if it's something I would go in on personally, but it might make a cool gift for like the DM or TTRPG or D&D or in your life. It features 80 recipes that are inspired by D&D writers, authors, and test kitchen chefs, like top chefs in there. environment, I guess. I couldn't really find out who the chefs were that were contributing. Maybe details on that are a little bit light. It retails for $35 USD and launches October 27th. It's actually up on Amazon now for, I think, $49 Canadian. It's named, of course, for the 5th edition spell Heroes Feast that allows you to create magnificent food for your parties that offers them bonuses and sustenance. This magnificent feast that you can summon. Well, now you can summon it at home. It's penned by Kyle Newman and John Peterson, who were both contributors or primary authors on the Art and Arcana compendium that was released last year for D&D. I think it was last year, featuring all this wonderful art from the realms and lore and things like that, the story around D&D. So they've engaged Newman and Peterson again to pen the D&D Heroes Fest official D&D cookbook, and Michael Whitwer, who's also in there for that as well. And they're both authors. Newman and Peterson are both pretty accomplished authors and directors in the film circuit too, so you may have heard them around somewhere. There are exclusive versions in some bookstores like Barnes & Noble's chapters that have additional benefits that come with the book if you pre-order. One of them is a full-size map of the Forgotten Realms that's actually marked with where these foods and lore items are from. So like I said, the same produces the Art and Arcana book, so you can expect kind of the same level of quality. Some of the samples of things that we saw in the Heroes Feast D&D cookbook include iron rations, hogs in bedrolls, like pigs in a blanket, Amphail braised beef. Now, for the most part, at a glance, it looked like a lot of these are just really basic recipes with some kind of D&D-ism slapped in front of it. But when I looked a little closer, I was pleasantly surprised at how they've really rounded this out as something that's supplementary to the D&D experience. Some of them have really nice twists, too. So it's interesting. I mean, if you're an accomplished chef, then it might be kind of so-so for you. But like I said, it makes a great gift item, I think. The recipes are marked with helpful cook's tips on each one, too. So there's a little snippet, a little bucket where the cook is they'll give you cooking tips and chef's tips, which are really interesting because those are things that I found, okay, these are really good techniques that are available or usable to you, anything that you're cooking in the kitchen or just, kitchen faring work, I suppose. There's also a little blurb on each one that blows out the lore that's tied to the recipe, that really sets its roots in the D&D world and ties it specifically to Faerun and the Forgotten Realms. A lot of these are directly related to Forgotten Realms. So, Spelljammer, Dark Sun, enthusiasts and hopefuls, we're going to have to wait a little bit more longer for content, even in a cookbook format. But it is kind of the flagship setting for D&D, so it makes sense. There are images of the finished product, and what they've done is they take the finished product and they'll do a photo shoot with it, and they'll kind of dress it with very medieval style fantasy accoutrement, like little daggers and sort of backdrops that are a little bit more fantasy. So it's neat how they've taken a visual of the finished product and kind of put it in its natural habitat, we'll say, which I thought was a neat touch. Additionally, it's not just food. There are snacks, there are appetizers, but there are also alcoholic drinks, so some adult beverages optioned in there, and I thought that was really cool. I'm glad they added that because as I was looking through it, I was like, I'm thinking, some drink recipes would be great to have too that are themed. So for example, there's one called the Mind Flayer, which is like a crushed iced purple vodka based drink. There's also a number of vegetarian mains included, as also options for folks who have different preferences for what they want or need or like to eat. Elven bread is kind of the popular one that you see showcased in the previews. And it does go beyond just like, here's bread and we called it Elven bread and we packed it up and we sold it to you. It's like a cinnamon fill kind of thing. It's a little bit different. And then of course they have the lore around Elven bread as it relates to the game. So really interesting proposition, I think. Of course it's, there's some cross-functional marketing play there too, like everything. And I think that's to be expected. But I really did feel that it's something that could be interesting. I'll probably stick to Pinterest personally, but like I said, a great gift. Or if you're kind of new to cooking and you like D&D, this might be a great way to kind of bridge the two and bring it together, make it a little more interesting for you. Otherwise, it would definitely be a hit on game night, so you can think about it that way too. The feature of this week's news is D&D and Pathfinder, specifically D&D versus Pathfinder and the proposed sibling rivalry between the two fantasy tabletop systems. This is something that's gone back and forth many, many times. Of course, it's rooted in a lot of history. to really put it simply, the advent of Pathfinder came as a necessity in a period where fans were sort of falling out of love with Wizards and D&D in the transition between 3.5 edition D&D and 4th edition D&D. And from that rose, like a phoenix from the ashes, Pathfinder, to answer the desire that fans and tabletop friends had that wanted that D&D core experience, the complexity and the customization that it offered, and weren't really identifying with 4th edition and what it was offering as a system. So effectively, in the most layman of terms, that is where Pathfinder was kind of given rise to. So there's been, like I said, a lot of back and forth as adventurers really try to branch out and try different flavors of systems. And I think the timing is right for that too. So as we see, everybody has kind of a favorite or a system that they prefer. I like to stay open-minded, and I think most of our community are similarly inclined. So people will dabble in one or the other. So to preface that, like I said in the beginning, I am far from a Pathfinder expert. If anything, I am a D&D specialist, you might say, but I'm not anchored to it. So it's really interesting for me to branch out into other systems and try to understand how they work. And I drew a lot of really cool things from Pathfinder. So like I said, Pathfinder was kind of given rise to through a catharsis where fans felt when D&D was deviating from what they loved about the genre. The setting for Pathfinder is Galarian, so this is the game setting world, which is akin to D&D's Forgotten Realms or Faerun. So they both have their own kind of enriched, fleshed out campaign settings and areas, regions. So they both come with something like that's similar between the two that'll be familiar to gamers on either side of both systems. So there are a lot of similarities between the two. I thought I'd tackle that first of all. Let's look at what is similar or familiar between the two systems. They're both D20-based RPGs, so your high fantasy RPGs on a D20 polyhedral system. They use the same dice. They use the same types of rolls. They have additive bonuses that stack up against skill checks to determine successes and failures, and a difficulty class that's determined to help define whether or not something is or can be successful. They have the standard library of cultures, races, history, lore, and distinct similarities between those two, between the classes or jobs, let's say, that characters can take on, your fighters or wizards and all that good stuff. Spellcasting and magic between the two systems are rooted in similar traditions. Slots, cantrips, and rituals, things like that tier the power of spells and how frequently they can use are all similar. That'll be familiar to you between both systems. The proficiency system and the ability to use certain skills, weapon, armor, and magics is similar. So there are criteria that you'll be required to fill so that you can use those types of things for your character. So no real shock value there, or no culture shock there. Inspiration that we're familiar with D&D is similar to a system called Hero Points in Pathfinder. So they work slightly differently, but those systems are there and familiar to you. And of course, the ease of use and the player experience overall, with fun and adaptability at the forefront, is evident in both systems, while some would argue that Pathfinder is maybe a little bit more in-depth, we'll say. So that said, let's talk about the primary differences. So these are the big ones that I think really define the two systems side by side. And like I said, look forward to anyone who has really good in-depth knowledge around Pathfinder to help me out here, because like I said, I'm open to it and I'm certainly not a specialist in it. But these are some of the early ones that I think would resonate with people who are new like me and interested in looking into it at first glance. So it's kind of geared towards that. There's no advantage or disadvantage in Pathfinder. What they do have is fortune and misfortune that uses modifiers to scale how difficult or easy something might be based on the situation. So it's based on a category of benefits rather than a simple roll 2d20 and take the higher or lower like the D&D system. And like I said earlier, a lot of these are point counterpoint. So some people like that simplicity, and that might be a benefit for them. Some people like the complexity and the added customization and flexibility that comes with more options that Pathfinder adds. So really, it's going to depend objective or subjectively on what you prefer. The action economy is a little bit different. Of course, in D&D, we know there's action, bonus action, reaction, and movement, and then there's free action is the sixth unspoken one. The action economy in Pathfinder is different, where you have 3 actions and 1 reaction, so you can basically use whatever you want, those actions for whatever you want to do. but some actions might require more action points, let's say. Maybe that's a better way to think about it. You have action points, and you can spend those on a budget to do things in combat. So it allows you a lot more flexibility and, I think, variety to what you'll see happen in the run of a turn. There are some penalties that might apply. For example, if you want to make multiple attacks, and that's a good kind of standard to explain this. If you have 3 action points, you can actually make 3 attacks. Everyone can do it right out of the gate, but you might suffer some penalties if you go 1, 2, 3 and use all your points to make attacks for that round. So it's balanced out that way, which, yes, definitely adds another layer of consideration, but also an added layer of customization and variety into how that game is going to play out with Pathfinder. Character customization, I think, is a real strong point that you'll see a difference of in Pathfinder versus D&D. Character customization in Pathfinder has a lot more flexibility when it comes to race, history, and culture, as well as class and subclass options, because they each invest in a character in a different way. So there's another thing that's interesting, and that is as your character progresses through levels, every single level you have the opportunity to choose a new feature or a new ability. So it's unlike D&D, although that does feature in D&D up until about level 4, but beyond that, you start to get something new like every couple of levels or every 3 levels in D&D. In Pathfinder, it's baked into the system where every single level you'll be in a position to pick something new for your character, which I like personally. So it really comes down to personal preference and flair there too, of course, which is usually the feedback that people will give when it comes to Pathfinder versus D&D. So lots of flexibility there, something new in every single level, and a healthy amount of feats that the player can take. So with a character progression that's heavily feat-based and customizable, of course, they have a huge roster of feats, and my next point is so many feats. There are a ton of feats and a ton of content for Pathfinder, where 5e requires the sacrifice of an ability slot increase or an ability skill increase. So to put that into context, at level 4, let's say in D&D, is typically the first level where you get to choose either an ability score increase or a feat that you can take. So you can either add +2 or to 1 ability or +1 to 2 abilities, or you can select a feat which comes with a host of options or benefits for your character depending on what feat you choose, but you have to sacrifice that level 4 ability increase. With Pathfinder, you get to basically choose a new feat every level. So you don't really sacrifice that because it doesn't quite play the same way. Thanks very much again. We're going to come back to alerts as well, so I haven't forgot you. I'll give you a shout out when we get through the segment. Thank you so much for your support. I do appreciate it, and I am listening, and I look forward to come back to you on that right after the news here. So many feats available in Pathfinder, which is a really great kind of new, flexible way to flesh out and blow out character creation, which I'm excited to really kind of explore, to be honest with you. Now, feats themselves come from different places in Pathfinder, and this is something that was significantly different, adding that complexity and customization to multiclassing. So there are 4 main areas where feats come from, and this is where we get to how race, culture, subclass, classes, and background really play into the makeup of your character. They come from ancestry, which essentially is your race, class, which is your vocation or your job, skill feats, and general feats, which is a set of feats that are available to all. So that's where your class and your race decisions are going to decide what library of feats are available to you every level. Ultimately, what this does is it really creates a ton of variety between all characters, particularly characters from the same subclass or genre. So if you're a fighter, in Pathfinder, there's a good chance that 2 fighters are not even going to be remotely the same, because you can pick pretty wildly from these library of feats. And I really like that a la carte approach to character customization, building, and development as it goes on. And like I said, you get to pick one every single level. I like that too, because it adds a flow where every single level you have something to look forward to, right? You're not just rolling hit points and then, let me put it this way. In D&D, let me know if you agree. I find it gets to a point where you're leveling, but you're looking at like level 7. Or, I'm really looking at level 9. I'm really looking at level 11. So you kind of care less when you level because you're really just looking for those milestone levels. With Pathfinder, there's something new at every level, and I kind of like that approach to the constant rewards and the constant benefits rolling in. There are various levels of competency in grades for proficiency, unlike D&D where you have a hard-coded proficiency bonus tied to your level, so it's +2 to start. At level 5, it goes up to +3, and that's kind of the global power modifier in D&D. In Pathfinder, there are varying degrees of those proficiencies. So depending on what your class is, depending on what you've invested in, there are 5 levels. There's untrained, which means you're untrained. You're pretty raw in that ability. There's trained, which means you have some proficiency. Expert, which means you're a lot more proficient. Master, and legendary. So as you level up, you can determine how far into these proficiencies you go. So that like every rogue with the same wisdom or the same dexterity doesn't have the same stealth modifier, let's say, right? You could be a fighter that goes a little deeper into stealth and be a little bit more proficient in that area. And I really like, again, adding to more customization. Complexity, yes, but also a lot more tangible complexity too, and customization of your characters. Again, this all feeds into the fact, which I really like, that no 2 characters are even likely to be remotely the same in the Pathfinder system. I think that's probably the biggest strength of it versus what D&D offers. So like I said, varying degrees of success as well that come with those proficiencies. Now, I do this in D&D anyway. I always use varying levels of success. So if you're making a check against a DC 15, let's say, I will still scale what the success looks like if you just barely roll a 15 or if you roll a 19 or a 22. So if you're investigating a room and it's a DC 15 to discover something, you roll a 15, you might discover that thing. But if you roll an 18, then you might discover a little bit more about it. So I've always used varying degrees of success, but it's nice to have it actually formalized in a system like it is in Pathfinder. So Pathfinder does have formalized varying degrees in success that have guidelines and how to kind of coach GMs on how that might play out in the system. So the more formalized, it tends to play more into spellcasting and magical effects, which is interesting too. So these varying degrees of success can also apply to your spell effects and how powerful they are or what the outcomes are, which is interesting. Those are some of the biggest, like primary, I would say, keystone differences between the two systems, or specifically how Pathfinder differs from D&D. But I did compile a few other things that I think are a little bit more nuanced. So some of the more nuanced differences that are quality of life, we'll say, or will definitely change your experience with the system, but might not necessarily be something that's a big sweeping change, include ability scores. So this is actually quite different, but the outcome is similar. So Pathfinder 2e specifically uses a different ability point system. The 1e uses something that's similar. You roll 4, keep 3, or your point buys, all those things that are familiar from D&D 5e. But Pathfinder 2e uses an interesting system where all stats start at 10, basically. They're all based at 10. And then it introduces boosts and flaws. And those boosts and flaws are defined by your class, your race, your culture. And then in addition, in your back pocket, you have 4 + 2 bonuses to distribute as you see fit. So think about it this way. You've got your strength, dex, con, you've got your intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. They all start at 10, and then you go down the race, and the race you select says, okay, you've got a fly here, so you get a -2 here, but you get a +2 here. You check all those off. You go into your class, you get a +2 to your primary stat, or a plus bonus to your primary stat. And then when you calculate all those, it kind of gives you the set of abilities you have based on your upbringing as a character, which I really do like. I like the idea of tying the abilities you have to your history, to your heritage, to your class, as opposed to just abstractly kind of min-maxing where the numbers go. And then you have 4 + 2 bonuses that you can distribute to customize even further. Again, this all relates back to the heavy customization and diversity of character we see in Pathfinder as a system too. There's no warlock, but they do have the alchemist class. So we don't have warlocks that we have in 5e D&D, but we do have alchemists as a new class. They're not one and the same, but they're just different. So there's no warlocks that feature. Paladin is handled a bit differently. It's not a class. It's actually a subclass or feature of the champion class, which is more kind of your swinging, your swordboard type fighter style. Hybrid races are handled a little bit differently. They're not their own race sections. They are actually subsections of the human race. So they take those kind of hybrid lineages and bake them under human. There's some other racial nuances that happen there too, but again, wide open complexity. So if you're a half-orc, it kind of draws back to your human ancestry, and then that ancestry determines like how you can apply benefits. It's quite open and flexible there. Progression and experience are handled differently. I want to make sure I get this right because I read up about it. I haven't gone through both books yet. I'm just reading through Pathfinder First Edition, but it's handled differently with separate guidelines for story and combat experience. Again, this is something that I do naturally. I always break my games down into story and combat, but it's nice to have it formalized in a game like Pathfinder. So they offer a different set of experience bonuses for things that are story and narrative oriented and things that are strictly combat based. And guidelines for how that works. And then it looked like, as I could see, that every level is 1,000 experience. It looks like every iteration is 1,000 experience you level. So that to me says that you don't have like scaling challenge ratings. Let's say where a dragon might be 150,000 experience and a goblin might be 25,000 experience. They will scale in difficulty, right? But their experience rewards are the same, which is a really interesting take. And I don't not like that. It just means that you're probably less concerned about challenge ratings and more concerned about the actual experience of fighting that thing and tactics, knowing that you're going to get whatever you get anyway. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I look forward to learning a little bit more about that. And finally, multi-classing is a little bit more nuanced in Pathfinder. So multi-classing uses dedications as opposed to taking another class. This is kind of simplified on the front end in D&D where you can just pick and choose what class you go into. But then on the back end later, you have to conform to a bunch of different effects that come from like spellcasting proficiencies and how they're awarded to choosing multi-class in D&D. With Pathfinder, it's a dedication, so it just opens up the feats for that class, and then you can kind of pick and choose in an a la carte fashion, which I really like. Think about it more as like if you're a fighter, it opens the door into wizard, and then you can start taking feats that are available to wizard. So again, tons of customization without having to say, okay, well, I'm like 3/4 fighter and 1/4 wizard. You just become a fighter who can dabble in wizardry, which I think is a much more fluid and interesting way to do it. And then there are some smaller subtleties that come into the differences between the two systems. Skills that are available, the flexible initiative. This is something that I really liked, how initiative is potentially handled in Pathfinder. You have the power. I mean, we always have the power as DMs to do whatever we want to do, but it's formalized once again. That's the difference. To say, okay, initiative works like this. We have initiative, but you were in the room and you're sneaking around and you're ready to get the jump on somebody as a rogue. How many times have you been in this situation, gang, where the rogue is ahead of everyone and then he jumps on a target, but then everybody rolls initiative and there's potential for the rogue to go last, right? I mean, you can still get a surprise. They can still be surprised. You can still get your full round of action before your enemies act. But doesn't it make sense in those situations that the rogue should go first because he or she is the one that's really initiating, right? So that is a really interesting way to add flexibility and we'll say discretionary initiative where you can place things based on the situation. And like I said, yes, we could argue that as DMs, we always have the availability to do that anyway, but it's really nice to have it formalized and structured in a system because otherwise we get into that age-old debate. It's like, well, why have rules in the first place, right? It's a game. Games have rules. This is why we choose the flavors that we like, right? So I really like that they've kind of baked that into the system itself. What else? Bulk is used for carrying capacity as opposed to encumbrance. In fact, I found encumbrance was so like annoying to me in 5e that I just did away with it. I don't use encumbrance at all. The encumbrance I use is common sense, right? You can't carry an armory on your back. No, you can't lug around 10,000 gold coins. You know, it's not like a video game. You don't pull up your inventory and see 1,000,000 gold, right? Encumbrance is common sense in my game. But in this case, they've actually added, or they've built in a system called bulk, which effectively is that formalized. So again, just really formalizing. That's why these are some of the smaller subtleties between the two systems. Instead of spells for classes, so in D&D we have like wizards can choose these 100 spells. They have spell streams, basically. So a line of spells that each class can choose from. But later they got opportunities to branch out in what they know in those spells, right? So what that means is specifically there are... let me see. I wrote it down here. Oh, give me a second. Where is that? I forget. I think there's like arcane, there's occult, and there is divine, and I can't remember the fourth. But effectively, wizards use arcane. They use like the arcane spell library. Bards use the occult spell library. So it's like separate spells that are defined for those classes, as opposed to saying like, well, rangers can use cure wounds and clerics can use cure wounds. It's like, here are the ranger spells, here are the cleric spells, here are the bard spells, which I think is really interesting and adds some distinct something special about those casting classes, right? Rather than having a bunch of totally different classes cast spells that are more or less the same thing. It's pretty neat there. As I mentioned, progression is handled a little bit differently. Hybrid classes are handled differently. So rangers, for example, are a lot more martial, a lot more combat oriented, and they're not like a hybrid spellcasting class, which tends to be a bit of more of a culture shock for D&D players. But apparently, they're a lot more badass in Pathfinder, and that's strictly heresy for me. I haven't actually played one or gone too far into the class, but it seems to be popular with Pathfinder players. While it might be a little bit different to D&Ders, paladins have more specific spell-like abilities and features, so they have spell-like effects that are distinctly and uniquely paladin. So things like that exist differently between the hybrid classes to shake things up a little bit, give you a reason to choose one or the other. There's a vast differentiation between prepared and spontaneous casting. How spellcasting works in Pathfinder is, as a wizard, let's say, you have to prepare the spells that you want for that day. Whereas in D&D, you have slots and you choose in the moment whether you want to cast a spell at a particular level. In Pathfinder, you have to basically prepare those spells at that level for that day every morning. And that honestly really comes down to preference. I could take it or leave it. This is the way that more old school versions of D&D were as well. You had to wake up and prepare your spells for the day and try to estimate what type of experiences you might be in so that you can pick the right types of spells to help you navigate those situations. And I did like that because there's something committal to it and there's something more real and granular about it that I enjoyed, as opposed to kind of the I guess the flexibility in spellcasting, which is not a bad thing either. So again, those two are, that might be a make or break for some people who are fans of spellcasting classes, but for the most part, it's really just, that comes down to preference. It's one of those ones that comes down to preference. While I hate going into this debate and saying, well, it depends on what you like, because that's pretty thin, right? We're here to give information. But that is one of those cases where it's really just an either or. There are way more options for weapons and way more varieties of weapons and properties that those weapons have. So there are 11 weapon properties in D&D 5e, like your two-hand, your finesse, your throne, things like that. There are way more options for weapons and varieties of what those weapons can do too. And there are also different abilities like cleave style effects that some weapons have for multi-target effects, which is kind of neat. I want to talk a little bit about some of the mechanical differences that exist between Pathfinder and D&D. There's no long or short rest, and there's no hit dice, which is interesting. Instead, there is far more or greater access to different ways for characters to regain hit points. It's based on time, the amount of time you take to heal, and your constitution modifier. But like I said, there are a lot more options usually available. The characters can craft health potions a little bit easier. There are ways that like healer types can heal the entire party to full if they have enough time and have the ability to make that effort, which I think makes sense, right? You know, when you're at camp and everybody's kind of winding down, the cleric's like, this divine cleric is like, well, I can heal you, and then I heal you, and that's all I can do. The rest of you have to wait till tomorrow. So I get the logic there, and I think it's kind of a neat, interesting way to handle that. Conditions like the ones we see in D&D have multiple layers of intensity. So stunned, for example, or unconscious, depending on how intense the effect is, will have a different outcome or play on your character. So again, more layered, more customized, more nuanced. And death, in similar fashion, has multiple layers as well. So how death works in Pathfinder, similar, you go down, you start to save against it, you roll against it. But if you recover from that, then depending on how intense intensely you flirted with death, let's say, you might be wounded. And if you're wounded and you fall again, then it has much more severe repercussions for falling close to death again. So it's this kind of scaling tiered approach to death, which I really which I like. In either system, D&D, Pathfinder, or anything, death has to be real, right? Like it has to be a real threat. That sting has to be there. That that burn and the worry that comes with with death creates that threatening tension, and it has to be real for players. And I think this is kind of a neat little micro system around death that adds layers to it, makes it a little bit more nuanced, still gives you opportunities to recover and recuperate, but with those severe penalties as well. So it's pretty neat. I want to kind of wrap up this segment with a simple side-by-side of ways that I felt in my research Pathfinder has D&D beat, and ways that I felt D&D maybe has the upper hand on Pathfinder. So a couple of ways that I thought Pathfinder had the upper hand. Character customization, which I've mentioned a number of times through the segment. Obviously, character customization is huge with Pathfinder. I think it's a super, super strong angle of the system. I think it's really kind of got things knocked. It is kind of a point counterpoint thing where, I had this conversation with my wife and she was overwhelmed just in the discussion of it. So what I really love about the complexity and the layers and the multiple options to customize and add diversity and variety to your characters might be overwhelming for some. So that's really going to depend on what your preference is. But I happen to like that deep complexity. I like being able to make a fighter and know that somebody else at the table as a fighter is going to be totally different. And I don't just mean totally different because I'm a battle master, she's an Eldritch Knight. I mean totally different as in like wildly different. As in I have 13 feats, she has 13 feats, and neither of us have any overlap there. So I thought that was a really great plus for Pathfinder. Specificity and individuality, which is mechanics driven. So these multiple proficiency levels, the depth with which you can find varying levels of success, varying levels of penalties, the ability to define how proficient you are in stealth versus how proficient you are in sleight of hand beyond just your global modifier and your ability modifier. I can be a fighter who really specializes in persuasion, right? I could be a diplomat who can also, wreck you with a longsword. So I really like that ability to it. Another big perk that Pathfinder has, and this kind of adds to their adage of no book left behind, is compatibility. So this is a big one for Pathfinder. They have a mandate to make sure that any system or new system or anything that's introduced is backwards compatible with other things. So what's my one big gripe about D&D today, like the current edition of 5e, is that every other new campaign compendium book is not really a new book. It's a republish of something from previous editions of D&D. Yawning Portal, Tomb of Annihilation, effectively a republish of Chult. Yawning Portal was literally an entire compendium of old editions of D&D ported forward for 5e. Right, there's a lot of that, and it's great. They're great adventures. They're great content, but they were also great adventures in the 80s. Right, Ghosts of Saltmarsh, absolutely, Reagan. A republish of the Greyhawk adventures. Right, there's like all they're doing is going back and they're taking all the things that were great back then and they're retooling them for 5e, and they're doing that 3 times a year and they're keeping it running that way. Sure, fine, it works. But Pathfinder has, because of their system where everything is backwards compatible, it puts them in a position to force them to come out with new stuff all the time because they don't need to. There's no merit in them republishing things because any player can take the old stuff and just port it forward like that. And it does have a template and kind of a port system to bring all that stuff forward. But I thought that was really neat. Like that's akin to like PlayStation 5 being able to play your PlayStation 4 games, so you're not losing that investment, which I think is not just a great systematic benefit, but it really speaks to like, customer care and a genuine interest in their player experience. So I think that's pretty cool too. Very clear rules options for defined and specific outcomes. So like I said, that multiple effects, conditions, things like that, rules that are standardized or at least formalized in the book. So you still have a lot of flexibility as a GM. And again, my disclaimer is we can do anything we want as GMs. but it gives you some formality around it, right? Like, here's how that actually works, or here's how this actually works, which is nice. The strength of the Pathfinder Society and the community around Pathfinder. Of course, I love our D&D community. It is what we make it, right? The people who we have here today, the people we have on Twitter and our other socials for D&D are wonderful people. But that's just it. They're wonderful people. You guys will still be wonderful people no matter what system we're in. But Pathfinder has really formalized the community with the Pathfinder Society. This is similar to what we see with like DM's Guild or Adventurers League, but you can't argue that Wizards of the Coast is deeply invested in DM's Guild or Adventurers League. It's just kind of a thing that they offer that other people run. Pathfinder Society is similar to that, but it's much more closely tied to Paizo and the brand and the system that they produce. So they've built like the community that supports the game into the experience of the game. And I think that's where they come up with these ideas such as No Book Left Behind, right? And finally, we have to address the elephant in the room. Paizo is just not mired in heavy social controversy right now the way that Wizards is, and that's an unfortunate reality of the environment they're in. I don't do like Politico or hot button topics on my show or in my communities in general. We want to keep it positive. It's Saturday, right? Let's keep it light, have fun. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that like Paizo right now is kind of free of that. They're not mired in the Politico that Wizards of the Coast and D&D specifically are today. So, fair is fair. Let's talk about ways that D&D has Pathfinder beat or might have the upper hand on Pathfinder. Again, counterpoint, the flexibility and the baseline structure of D&D 5e, the fact that it's very malleable, very easy to pick up, quick to get into and play is a huge draw for a lot of players, myself included. That's what got me back into D&D, and it's what has created an opportunity for a lot of players to experience tabletop role-playing games, D&D and others, bar none. So the flexibility and the baseline structure, I think, is a really strong point of D&D 5e today. Because of those tools and the malleability and the flexibility you have with them, it's a lot easier for GMs and players to make in the moment gut calls, right? So if there's, I do find with D&D, anything that happens, I can very easily say, okay, I know how to make this work in this system and it makes sense. So because of that baseline approach, it's very easy for GMs to make up things and deal with things on the fly, no matter what is kind of thrown at you. Whereas when I guess the backslide of having so much customization and formality around a system like Pathfinder is that it becomes more difficult. You become more inclined to try and figure out, okay, how does Pathfinder do this versus saying, okay, here's what I think makes sense for this to happen. Ease of use, simple character builds. Characters are really simplified, and the creation options for creating characters very quick. Again, simplify. That seems to be kind of the 1-2 punch of D&D 5e. And then, of course, equally, we have to mention the nostalgia, the history that D&D has in the space, the marketing push and the marketing support they have. Like, flat out, D&D has Wizards, who has Hasbro. That's a huge machine to really get these things into market, support them with capital, and make sure that the games that we're playing and understanding and learning are going to be there for a long time. Not that Paizo's under any threat that way, but like D&D benefits from Hasbro's massive marketing machine, right? And they have the resources to keep producing and pumping out content, accessories, dice. Because of that, the community is just a lot larger. It's a lot larger. There are bigger influencers. There is a huger player base, much more huge player base, which means finding games and players is a little bit easier. And we hear this all the time in the community that the biggest challenge facing players who want to branch out into other systems is finding other players to play those systems. So my disclaimer on that is if you've ever been on the fence, get out there, try something new, find somebody who's running a game looking for players because they would love to have you at their tables. There are a lot of TTRPGers who are dying to try new systems, and all they need is somebody like you to show up and show an interest. So that's what I'll leave it on. Effectively, that's the side-by-side between D&D 5e and Pathfinder 1e and 2e coming down the pipe, and some of the main things that I think really define both of those systems side-by-side with one another. I look forward to continuing to learn about Pathfinder, so if there's anything that you have to offer that conversation, like I said, I'm far from an expert. I'm wide open to your feedback. I may not have gotten everything 100%, and I apologize if I missed something on like that. I tried to do it justice, but I look forward to your feedback, so don't be shy with it. To round out the news this week, I have one item that I want to jump into because a lot of my focus is on third-party creators and people who want to write and develop content for D&D. Well, the Adventurers League, speaking of structured play, announced this week that they're seeking Tier 4 designers specifically. I'll blow through this really quick because we want to get into the other segments of the show and get ready for game prep, of course. And I want to get caught up on chat and all the wonderful people who supported today during that segment. So this week, D&D Adventurers League made a call to get more designers into the path of creating content officially and modules for their systems. So they're specifically trying to grow the roster of Tier 4 designers for Adventure League. Tier 4 is level 17 to 20 in their structured play system. So designing for Adventurers League and structured play is wildly different from just writing an amazing adventure. It needs to be said. So there is a ton of feedback in the process. There's a lot of reiterating and iterating of these products. It has to fall into very specific guidelines for Adventure League structured play, which are available on the website. But it's not like... if you're going into this, you need to be aware that it's not, I'm going to come up with this amazing adventure. It's going to be great. Everyone's going to love it. There are very specific requirements they have for it, but it is a stream to produce official D&D content. So here's what they're seeking specifically. They're looking for Tier 4 design adventure submissions, which is level 17 to 20, like I said. They have to be set in the Forgotten Realms setting of Faerun, of course, the flagship setting for D&D. They're looking for you to submit a single encounter, which has to be 500 words or less. I cannot write less than 1,000 words personally, so that might write me out of it. One page, no art, no fancy layouts, very, very simple. Like the text really has to do the work. If you're going to submit to this, has to be in a DocX Word, Microsoft Office Word format, no free Word or open Word or anything like that. It has to be DocX. And it must use the Adventurers League style sheets and structure, the templates that are all provided by Adventurers League as well. So they're calling on specifically designers to work together and collaborate on these, as much collaboration as you can do in 500 words or less, I suppose, in a one-pager. But those are some of the specifics about what they're looking for. Some examples they gave, like if you're looking at doing something like this, might be an iconic creature combat encounter. Very simple, start to finish. It's encapsulated, right? Episodic. Or an engaging role-play encounter that might involve some high-level abilities or encounters, or engagements rather. So keeping in mind that if you're going to do that they need to be level 17 to 20, which makes role-playing encounters a little bit tricky, but it'll be an interesting challenge. If you are interested in submitting, here's how you do it. You download the S9 adventure format.docx template from adventurersleague.org. You want to submit the application form first with all of your information and then upload your submission. They've assured that they're not, they're asking people to submit with a non-identifying email address so that it can be free of subjective bias, which means like if you have at polygon.com as your email address or at paizo.com, maybe just set up a Gmail to submit because they don't want to influence their decisions based on where those submissions are coming from, which I think is noble, honestly. And they've clarified that they're not going to compile these submissions or distribute or use them at all. Think of this more as like a pitch. It's more of an opportunity for you to get your stuff in front of somebody and pitch how you would do something like this. They're going to delete the database once it's done, so they're not using it for anything. So don't worry about if you submit something, it doesn't get picked, or at least if they're held to that level of honesty, they're going to delete it after this exercise. So it's really just a pitch to show them what you can do, which is why I think they've limited it down to 500 words in a single pager with no art or any of the embellishments that go with things like this usually. So they're really just looking for it to scout talent and add designers to the roster. The deadline for submissions, if you are interested, is 5 p.m. Eastern time on Friday, July 24th, 2020. So those of you creators out there who've dreamed of, creating some official adventure content for D&D, this is a good opportunity for you to get a little bit more than just an ad hoc pitch in front of some people who will review it. And you never know, you might get some follow-up there and be engaged to write adventure module content for Adventurers League, structured play, or maybe something else in the Wizards environment. But that's a wrap for D&D Weekly News on the Speak and Comment podcast today.